Hello friends, and welcome to this video which is based on our readings this week in Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 1 through chapter 7 and verse 38. And as you noticed in your readings, this section gives us laws concerning the offerings and sacrifices which the Lord gave to Moses. This text regulates 5 sacrifices in ancient Israel: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. And here in these 7 chapters we have instructions, very detailed instructions, don't we, for the burnt offering from the herd, the flock, and the fowl, for uncooked and cooked grain offerings, for the fellowship or the well-being offering from the herd, the flock, and the goats, the sin offering for inadvertent sins of the high priest, inadvertent sins of the congregation, inadvertent sins of rulers, inadvertent sins of individuals, and sin offerings for specific inadvertent offenses. And then we have guilt offerings for, those who commit inadvertent sins and for those who commit deliberate sins. And then we have instructions for the disposal of all of those offerings. Whew, boy, that's a ton of specific, detailed instructions and a ton of animals slaughtered. A lot of bloodshed in that Old Testament system of worship, right? Animal sacrifice. As a religious expression in the ancient Near East, animal sacrifice was a common practice. Now, what we learn from these practices is that the animal victim was a substitute for the worshiper. The sacrifice in some way, made possible reconciliation between the worshiper and God. So, the sacrifice was a way to restore the worshiper to the favor of God. So these sacrifices then were very important. And of course, another thing that we learn from all of the blood shed in these sacrifices is the seriousness of sin, at least the seriousness of sin in the eyes of God. For God, sin had to be dealt with if he was able to keep company with his children. And all of the animal sacrifices made it possible for those sins to be forgiven. And only in this way was it possible for a holy God who was separate from sin, having nothing to do with sin. Only in this way was it possible for that kind of a God to reside among sinful people. And again, the animal was a substitute for the one who offered it. So we read of someone taking the animal to the entrance of the tabernacle and placing his hand on the animal's head. And that symbolized the transfer of sins from the worshiper to the animal, which placed the animal under the penalty of death. It was to die in the worshiper's stead. And for us, all of these sacrifices only point to Christ in the New Testament. Paul says that he is our sin offering. I'm thinking of a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21. For our sake, he, that would be God, for our sake God made him, that would be Jesus. God made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21. And so all of this reading in Leviticus about sacrifice certainly makes us appreciate more and more the sacrifice of Jesus. And here was one thing that impressed me in our readings. Sin offerings were determined by a person's economic position. So in chapter 5, for example, the one offering the sin offering was commanded to offer a female goat. And if he could not afford a female goat, he could offer a female sheep. And if he could not afford a sheep, he could offer 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And if he could not offer those birds, he could offer 1/10 of an ephah of choice flour. In other words, every sacrifice had to cost the worshipers something, but there was no desire on God's part to impoverish his people. And what does that tell us about our God? Finally, I was impressed anew in these readings with the need for the Israelites to follow the instructions for their worship that God commanded Moses. It was very important, I suppose, that they obeyed those instructions to the letter. Hey, the church today must remain obedient to the proper worship of God, right? We read about the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. They were an example of an early church where believers were not obediently carrying out the proper worship of God. And Paul admonished them to make sure that their worship was done in order. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 40. Now, I think we should say just here that we don't have a Leviticus in our New Testaments today. That is, we don't have a document in the New Testament that gives us the kind of detailed prescriptions for worship, for how God wants us to worship him today as he did under the Old Testament system. But there is a principle in Leviticus that we have learned, that we're going to learn even more and more, and that is that God cares how we worship him. And that principle is true under the New Covenant, just as it was under the Old Covenant. That principle must surely apply even in our day and time. That our worship is carried out in accordance with what God has revealed to us must still be vitally important. May God continue to bless our reading and our understanding of his word. And I hope to see you again next week.